audience. Welcome to this week's episode of Leadership Podcast, where we hope that our discussions and disagreements inform your decisions. This week, we are going to be talking about American culture and what that means to us and how we think that that informs how the different parties interact and some of the conflict that we see in our current state of politics. For our new viewers, I am Thea Alley, and I'm joined by my friends Dion, Will, and Brett. And the four of us represent different perspectives across the political spectrum. And our goal in this discussion tonight, like every other night, is to see if we can better understand where each of us individually are coming from, and also hopefully be able to try to bring in a conversation about, how each of our political ideologies influences how we see the world and how we think that we can better communicate with one another to learn more and maybe, not be in such a polarized political climate. Okay. So now that we get that out of the way, last week, for those of you who were listening, we were talking about DEI. And as we were talking about DEI, it opened up a discussion about culture and how cultural differences can sometimes be a division in different environments, right? Different, whether it be the workplace, academic environments, or how it can influence how we talk about politics. And so that led us to say, well, hey, maybe we should talk about, well, what does culture mean, and what role does it play? So that's kind of how we got here. I don't know who wants to start off. I guess the first thing to kind of think, we normally will try to set a baseline and define the word. Like, I feel like, Dion, you're always like our resident expert when it comes to defining terms, So I think that's probably a good place to start.
Okay. Yeah, I did find some definitions, and what I found really interesting was this Georgetown University page that had a whole bunch of different definitions that it pulled together from a lot of different sources. I think the one that I found that was succinct but also kind of it encompassed just about everything that I thought the definition should have in it was this one that says culture is a set of meanings, behavioral norms, and values used by members of a particular society as they construct their unique view of the world. I think that very well sums it up. It's not everything, and we can go into obviously we're going to go into much more detail about it, but I think that's a good starting place.
So when I used to teach this to the cadets at the academy, and we would talk about, what American culture and what it means, and it was always, as it relates to the two-party system and everything, we would often start our conversation with, liberty versus equality as two kind of major aspects of American culture, but that those two things are somewhat in conflict with each other, or liberty versus freedom, and those two things are in conflict with each other. The more liberty, the more free that you let someone be, the less equal, people could be treated. Like if you, you're free to go, whatever, kill people, then other people's, equal rights are being attacked or in conflict with. And, we were just kind of talk about where the two-party system, where Democrats versus Republicans, where they are liberals versus conservatives, where they would fall, along that spectrum, because these terms are all, they're all aspects of American political culture. And, whether you lean more towards equality or more towards liberty, there's no wrong answer, but I think whether you're left or right leaning, you just tend to lean towards one of those aspects of American culture more than another one.
Are you sure there's no wrong answer when we're talking about American culture? I'm going to throw up air quotes here, American culture, right? Because I don't know, like that, isn't that one of the things that we're kind of discussing here is like, I feel like when we say, well, this is American culture, right? Like there are certainly sayings from the past, right? That's as American as baseball and apple pie, or the things like that, right? And so there certainly is, like, nobody would ever say that's as American as cricket, because that doesn't make any sense. So that definitely is a wrong answer. Along those lines, Will, I would say that there probably is a certain amount of freedom, like anarchy, that is not really American. And then there's a certain amount of like collectivism, like, communism, that is not American, right? So I would say, like, on those two extreme ends, those are probably wrong answers for the vast majority of people if you ask them about American culture.
So, all right. So you, I'm not going to say that you're an anarchist, but aren't libertarians about as far on the freedom spectrum as, like, you want as little government as possible, which is as close to anarchy as you can get without being anarchist, right? And I wouldn't say that libertarians are un-American.
There are libertarians who are like anarcho-capitalists who truly believe like you could completely dissolve the state and everything would be fine. I'm not one of those libertarians. I am more of like a minimal statist. And I think, again, the Constitution, it does a pretty good job of laying out what I think the role of government should be, and everything outside of that, for the most part, with rare exceptions, is government overreach.
And so I'm only bringing that up to say that, I mean, pure anarchy, yeah, is probably not American, but you can go pretty far on the spectrum and still, in my opinion, still be like, it's okay to have those beliefs, as libertarians do. And
so I think we're approaching this kind of from a fallacy standpoint, because when we're talking about culture, right, and values, ethics, morals, all of those things, the government is an extension of those things, right? The government doesn't define those. It's one of those, like, you can't legislate morality. You have to have that common set of beliefs, that common set of morals to actually have a culture to start with, right? If you just believe in anything and everything, you're going to have a lot of competing factions. You're going to just have a bunch of tribalism rather than a cohesive nation. So when we start talking about American values, American culture, I think we have to kind of almost step back from today and what is, at least in my view, where culture is starting to unravel, where we're starting to see too many threads coming from a common area. It's becoming a problem. We need to go back to where, when we were a cohesive nation and we were moving in a positive direction. Now, again, that's not to say that we were doing everything correctly. Because, I mean, honestly, I don't think we're ever going to do everything correctly. There's always going to be issues that we deal with. That's the purpose of having government and people being involved in those. But at the same time, when you look at when America was thriving and becoming an incredibly prosperous nation, there were a set of core values that the vast majority of the populace held. And that's where I had kind of brought up that point last week when we were talking about, we're seeing this push against culture and values that people don't like. And that's where a lot of the issues came up with some of the progressive ideas within DEI, is that it's pushing against that culture. And so I think kind of coming back to that and talking about where the foundations are, I think is really where we need to look at this and kind of see where have we got to today and where is that leading us.
Well, my question is going to start then, because I agree with you, Brett, where I would say that I think culture is really a way of life, and how you see your way of life, what defines it. But I guess my first question, is when you talk about this time in our history where we had some type of cohesive culture, what time period are you referring to?
I'm not really sure if we could nail it down to like a decade or anything like that. I mean, if you look at the United States, we're barely over 200 years old as it is,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, I mean, in terms of world culture, it's a relatively new concept.
Mm-hmm.
But if you kind of take the general themes over that time frame, I think there's a lot of values that kind of stand out. You have, work ethic as one of those. You have innovation as one. Um, I'm trying to think some of the other things that really sort of stood out to me as I was going through this. Um, I know a lot of people today don't like the idea of it, and there seems to be a lot of revisionist history that goes along this. But there were some very deep religious roots that played into the forming of the country. The Judeo-Christian standpoint of kind of where we come from. I mean, you can go back and one of my sources that I had gone through shows that there's over 250 founding era leaders that believed that Christianity was a vital part of the culture. Because there's an aspect that goes along to the productivity side of that, right? One of the scriptures in the Bible says if a man doesn't work, he doesn't eat. And so that idea of productivity and innovation kind of came from that to where we were supposed to be industrious as a culture. And so, like I said, it's not necessarily pinpointed to a particular, decade or time frame. It's more over the course of history that is, taken us from a founding country to where we were incredibly processed. We became a world power. And now where we kind of see, okay, now where are we starting to go?
I
So,
think the
Brent,
thing
I
that
would say,
hold on. Let me. I have to make an important point. Can you guys hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Am I frozen? Okay. The thing, whenever I hear people talk about culture and we talk about American history and how our culture and the founders and the beliefs and morals led us to be great, where I struggle is if as long as we acknowledge that culture included inherent inequities and inequality for certain members of our society, in particular racial minorities and women. And so this was a culture that was built on inequality. And so I think this is why a lot of people, when they hear the term "Make America Great Again," take offense to it, because it seems to imply that there is a desire to go back to a point in our history in which certain people were able to prosper and others were not, and that the system was designed that way. It was designed to elevate certain members of our society while oppressing others. And so that's where, when we talk about American culture, I think that's the ugly baby that a lot of times we don't want to acknowledge, and we haven't figured out a way to rectify it. If you want to glorify a certain time period without acknowledging that it wasn't just a couple people, or it wasn't just, lack of political correctness that led that culture to be great. It was oppression and harm that was done to large groups of people. So that's the part that I struggle with when we have these
Yeah.
conversations.
And Thea, and I'm not saying that we need to look past that stuff. That's the important part about when you go back and look at history, that you don't have this revisionist kind of changing of things to where you remove certain aspects of it, whether good or bad. You have to look at, what was effective, what was real, but you have to look at it in its totality, right? Because
Yeah.
I think it was Mark Twain said that, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Right. It's
Yeah.
one of those things that we
Yeah.
may not do the exact same things that prior societies have done, or even if we go back to what we were. But if we don't remember where we came from, both from good founding standpoints, but also to things that we did wrong, how are we ever going to improve upon it? So yeah, absolutely, we have to include that kind of stuff. But when we start going back and we look at our founding fathers, we take George Washington as an example, and you look at him in only terms of, slavery and how he thought about that, rather than looking at things of, what was his faith like? What was his leadership like? What was his public sacrifice like? Those kind of things, like the noble characteristics, while acknowledging that someone was flawed, there are still things that we can cheer for and applaud that come out of that. And those are the things that we need to look for, while tempering ourselves to the future where we don't repeat those same mistakes.
Well, I
so
guess
what I
the
was
thing
going
that
to
I'm struggling. Okay, go on, Neon.
Yeah, so I was going to tag on a little bit, and it kind of goes along the lines of what you were saying, Thea, but from a slightly different perspective, which is that I think that we're kidding ourselves if we think that division and arguments are not actually part of our DNA in this country. And it goes all the way back to the original 13 colonies, the way that they bickered between each other about how they wanted to expand their frontiers, how they engaged with each other. When you look at the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist papers, there was a very clear, strong debate about the future of the country at the time that they were writing the Constitution. You look at the Civil War, right? That happened less than 100 years after the Constitution was signed and put into place. And you look at the North was very much marching towards this industrialization, while the South tried to maintain the slavery-powered agrarian society. You look at when somebody says things about people from other countries talk about America as this monolith, and we all have been all over the country, right? We've been to the Northeast. You go to Boston, that is a very different American than what you find in Miami or what you find in Dallas or Honolulu or Anchorage, right? Like those are all very different Americans, yet they're all American. And so I think just part of our DNA from the beginning is the ability to be a diverse people with a diverse set of ideas and beliefs, and yet somehow find cohesion in the United States, right? Brett, I think last week you said e pluribus unum, right? Out of many, one is what we've always striven to do.
Yeah, and that's where the difference, like when you start looking at this and seeing things in terms of like the multiculturalism that is so prevalent today and celebrated. And there's a difference between being multicultural and being multi-ethnic, right? Having different ethnicities and different backgrounds, and having a different culture that you come from that you're proud of is one thing. But when you fail to assimilate to some level to the society that you're in, to become a part of that creates problems, right? It's the only way a multi-ethnic society really works is we all have to come and play by the same rules and live by the same set of basic moral values. And that's where I'm coming to with this in terms of looking at American culture and what has made us great.
But I think that the problem becomes what defines the assimilation piece, right? And I don't know how all of you feel as far as your identity and what, do you feel that you toe the lines between different cultures? But I definitely do, right? I'm first generation American. I'm Black. I grew up in the U.S. and I can say that there is definitely such a thing as Black American culture that differs from white American culture. And I feel like a lot of times Black people, we're very aware of the dual nature of those cultures, but white people are not necessarily. And I always find that fascinating, right? The whole idea of code switching, which means like for people who belong to multiple cultures is that you're your authentic self and you're at home and you're around your family. But if you go into like the workplace or predominantly white space, you have to speak a certain way, carry yourself a certain way, because if you are your authentic self, that might be offensive to white people or make them feel uncomfortable. And that's like a very real thing. Like, a funny example of it is, I don't know if you guys ever watched the show Key and Peele, but they did a skit of how Obama says hi to like white constituents versus like Black constituents. And you see him like when he sees like a white constituent, he shakes hi, nice to meet you, Barack Obama. And then when he would see like a Black constituent, he would like pull him in, give him like the chest bump and everything. And that's a joke, but then they showed real footage. Like there's real footage of Barack Obama doing that. And that's just like, and I'm sure I'm guilty of that. I know an example of this. I went to the opera in Santa Fe when I was clerking at the 10th Circuit, and all my fellow law clerks were white. And we were in the opera and I'm dressed up and there is this older Black woman and she comes up to me and she says, "Welcome. I'm so glad that you came. You look so nice. Is this your first time?" And she's like talking to me. She walks away and my fellow clerks go, "Do you know that woman? Like, why was she speaking to you?" And I said, "Oh, we're the only two Black people that are here." And so I knew the minute she walked up to me, I knew that was her way of saying, "I see you. I hope you feel comfortable. I'm glad that you're here." And that's a common occurrence in my life. And I pointed out to them, I said, from now on, pay attention. Wherever we go, if there's only one other Black person, they're either going to speak to me or make eye contact. And over time, they started paying attention to that and they noticed it, and it was something they were never aware of prior to. I only bring up those examples to say that's like very common, that there is a subculture that's very American to Black people, but it's not necessarily something that other people are aware of, which just shows like how complex culture is, because it can be universal to millions of people, and it's very American. And the other reason I point out that that's an American trait is when I travel overseas as a Black person, I don't get the same interaction with other Black people in like Europe or in Asia. You know what I mean? They're not coming up to speak to me and feeling the need to connect to me in the same way that I would have in America. So I always find that to be uniquely American, but yet it wouldn't be the same experience for the three of you guys. So that's where, and it informs. That's like, as far as Black people are not going to respond to you the way they respond to me in America. That's what I mean.
I mean, there is also like, I mean, if you go to any like little Koreatown or Chinatown in any city, or, you know, there's usually like a Latino neighborhood or something, like you can definitely tell that there is code switching going on there as well. So it's that's not a uniquely Black thing. In fact, like I find myself being half Asian. Like when I go to Costco, as soon as I hit the Costco parking lot, I have to start driving much worse than I normally do, just so that I can.
Ouch. You said that. Nobody else said that.
I'm the only one that can say that.
But you're not a woman. I mean,
yeah, that's
so
true.
Brett, I was gonna ask you, when you were talking about assimilation, the problem that I have with the assimilation argument is like the United States is a cultural melting pot. There's like, what would you have people assimilate to? It comes across as you need to assimilate to the white male culture, not because if the United States is a melting pot of cultures already, what is it that you're asking people to assimilate to? Like, it seems like they should be able to keep some level of their own culture. Like there's no standard to assimilate to.
Sure. And so my thoughts on that is that there is obviously room for personality, right, when it comes to that. But I think the difference that we're kind of seeing is, you know, America in terms of the melting pot, unfortunately, that's sort of an outdated metaphor, because we're not that anymore. We're more of a salad bowl, right? To where it's like we're mixed together, but we're still very separate, right? You can easily pick apart the pieces and separate it back into something, whereas a melting pot, everything blends together. So when you're talking about assimilation from that standpoint, I think maybe looking to Sweden, right, is a great example, because I know typically a lot of liberals and progressives look to Sweden as like the ideal, you know, example that America should emulate, because they are a society that, you know, they were crime free, generous welfare system, free healthcare, free college, all those kind of things. However, that Sweden doesn't exist anymore, right? Because that cohesive society was based on shared values, one language, and social solidarity, where, you know,
and 100% white and Swedish.
I was going to say that. I mean, I don't look to Sweden because it's an all-white country, and that's always been the issue. That's what it was known like when it was idolized as this, like, you know, bastion of, you know, whatever. It was part of what allowed it to be that way was that it was predominantly one race. It wasn't a multiracial country.
I'm curious though, as to why race defines culture. Right. Why is it the melanin count of your skin suddenly defines what culture is? Why isn't it a matter of shared value?
When you have a country where people look the same, then there is not the inherent need to then have to decide how do you deal with the differences between your people. So I don't look to Sweden as an example when it doesn't have to deal with the issue that you have people who are of different races. In America, we have people who are different, like we say, we have people who have different ethnic backgrounds, different racial backgrounds, and we have a history of inequality based on race in this country. And so we can't ignore that in how we come together. If we're going to come together, we have to also acknowledge the differences that their lived experiences. And so when you say, why does it matter? I think that it matters to be able to look at someone like my father in the eye and acknowledge what his American experience has been based on a child who grew up in the segregated South and has lived through, like, civil rights is not it's not something he read in the history books. It's something he's lived. It dominated a huge part of his life, and he's still trying to reconcile that. And so I do think that's part of people's stories, whether we like it or not. And I think we have to be able to have real conversations about that and have empathy for what that means for different people coming from different parts of the country. And so I do think it's important, if we're going to look to any other countries to say, okay, that they're an example of what America could or should be, we have to know that they've also addressed these types of issues within their culture.
But see, no country has ever been like America. And so there's no
Exactly.
example that we have to lean to that. So when you start looking
I
at those
agree.
kind of things, it's like we almost have to go back into ourselves and see that.
I
Like
agree.
you're kind of carrying with the Sweden example. That's one of those, like, you look back at 2000 when that was sort of the case, when, only about 1 million out of the 10,000 or 10 million people that were there were foreign born, where now that has increased to more than double that in 2024. And they've,
And they're struggling.
They are,
Yeah.
very much so. And
That's
it's because what has
why
happened is you have brought so many more cultures into the environment where you no longer have shared values and that social solidarity. And so, Thea, that's kind of my point, is that we continue to drive this wedge between the different ethnic basis of America instead of coming together as Americans. Like, we hyphenate everything. We separate everything. There's constant division. It doesn't mean that we can't have personalities within our cultures, which, and again, I don't like using the term culture from that standpoint because, yes, I agree. Because, I've got several friends that are out in Delaware, they're Black community. They're part of my business partners. And it's always fun getting them around them because they are very different from how I grew up. Just like we were having this conversation the other day. Apparently there is multiple birthday songs, right?
Yep.
You ask any white person, there's one birthday song. You talk to Black people, there's either 2 or 3, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you come to my family, if you come and it's time to sing Happy Birthday, we're singing Stevie Wonder's Happy Birthday.
Yeah.
Happy birthday to you. And that's just how I didn't know until I was like 7 or 8, and I started going to birthday parties of other kids. And I grew up here, so I went to like a white birthday party and they're singing the regular Happy Birthday, and I waited for Stevie Wonder. I was like, when are we going to sing the other Happy Birthday? Like, what's going on?
So, and
So
that's
you're
my
right.
point, Theo, when we're talking about like personality, right? Like, there is room for that. But then when we start talking about shared values and basic moral beliefs, that's where we start to have differences. And when we start separating ourselves from having those basic moral values and beliefs in terms of hard work and ethic behavior, and I mean, honestly, I think one of the things that has really separated us as a culture is we've got to the point where we are so individualistic, to where it's all about the individual freedoms. It's all about what's best for me. And we've gotten away from what is best for the common good. It's all about that individual expression of freedom, to where, yeah, there has to be some level of constraints there. There's actually freedom found within constraints. Discipline equals freedom in certain things. It's like in your finances. If you're disciplined with your finances, you have freedom later on. If you're disciplined with your health, you have greater freedoms later on. And it's the same thing with our values and our beliefs, whereas if you just live completely loose and free about everything, there are consequences to that extend beyond just your personal self, that has impact on the people around you. And so when we live in this moral relativism, I think we're just having a complete breakdown in cohesion of our society. And that's what I said. That's not a matter of personality of the different ethnic backgrounds, but we don't have a common moral fabric anymore.
Well, I will push back a little bit on your characterization of personality versus like shared values and moral compasses, right? From the perspective of, to certain people, I think. Well, let me just say. So, for example, right now, what I'm seeing, at least coming from the right, in particular the administration, is this pushback on certain people being allowed to even exist in our society, or being told that they don't have, there's not a place for them, whether it be people who belong to the LGBTQ community, or certain people who don't share who don't assimilate or conform enough to the way that the administration is defining our culture, right? And so you have, like, I forget, I for some reason I cannot commit her name to memory, but the White House spokesperson, and last week she made this comment: we need less of this and more, less LGBT Harvard people and more hardworking Americans, as if those two things are mutually exclusive, as if to say, if because you're gay, you're not hardworking, or because you went to Harvard and you're gay, that somehow means that you don't fit into this other category of American. And that's where I think the tension is, that because of people's identities, they're somehow being excluded from the group. There's an assumption that they don't believe in the same values, right? And then it makes people feel defensive. It's like, well, yes, I may be X, but that doesn't mean I'm not Y, right? So like,
Yeah,
you're
and that's the
talking
danger
about
of identity politics, right? When we start getting like, well, you have to believe this to be on this political party, and it goes both
I
ways.
agree.
Yes,
I'm
I
not
am
saying
the
that.
Republican representative here from that regard, but
Yeah,
I've said before, I don't believe in everything that the party stands for, that the administration
yeah.
does.
But I'm just saying that is something that is, I think, shaping the conversation in a dangerous way, is where you're, not you, but at where, like, to be the thing also equates to not having the same values, right? And as if because you're X, you don't share these values. And I think that's where we are seeing this, like, people going into their own corners, and some of the tribalism is because we for some reason want to exclude each other from having, I guess, whatever moral high ground it is when it comes to what it means to quote unquote be American.
And Brett, it sounded like when you were talking about your Sweden example, that was the vibe that I was getting from that discussion from you, is that this is going to sound bad, and I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but essentially it came across as Sweden was great when it was 100% white. And now that there's all these foreigners coming in, now they're having all these problems. Why can't they just be more like the original Swedes? That somehow the immigrants moving in, just by nature of them being an immigrant, are somehow incompatible values wise with Swedes.
No, and I understand how that could come across that way without further explanation, right? And so it's the idea that, again, multiculturalism, it gets to the point where you lose the direction of everybody pulling in the same direction, right? Again, that e pluribus unum, right? And instead you get more of an e pluribus pluribus, where you get out of many as many, where you start to see it's more about people coming into the Western cultures, but they're forming their own communities and their own rules and their own practices. And they see any Western ideas as kind of an extension of colonialism, like where it's being forced upon them. But you have that when you have cultures that come in and they don't adopt to the practices of the area, you continue to have that division. And again, it doesn't mean that you can't have, again, that flavor, that personality that comes with your view, because having immigration is an incredible thing, right? Now, again, that's a whole other discussion that's going on politically right now, too, in terms of how immigration is done. But I mean, you look at things like, the founder of NVIDIA, he's from Taiwan, right? The current CEO of Microsoft, I think he's from India. I'm sure everybody's favorite example, Elon Musk, South America or South Africa. But even going further back, I mean, you have incredible examples like Einstein, came from Germany, but when he came over here, he didn't continue to be a German. Like, he became an American with a German background, right? And so there's a big difference that's there, is assimilating to the culture from that standpoint,
So
but still
how do you feel
remembering.
about language? Do you feel that if somebody moves to the US, they need to speak English?
Yeah, they do. Because honestly, if I move to Germany, I'm going to have to speak German. If I move to Korea, I'm going to have to speak Korean. If I move to a different country other than America, it's going to be expected to be effective in that society. I need to learn their language.
So for people who don't, do you feel that then they, even if they live here, become a citizen, but they don't learn English, that they aren't American?
I mean, they're still a citizen from that standpoint, but I think they're still pushing back against the culture in that aspect, that they're not assimilating to that degree. Because how can you truly become part of a society if you're not becoming part of the society? Like, you're coming in, but you're staying separate.
I think it feels like you're romanticizing the past. We have never, like your earlier point about how we're not a melting pot anymore. We're more like a salad bowl now. I think we've always been a salad bowl. When you look at American history, whether it's the Italians coming in, the Polish coming in, Japanese coming, any like all of these groups. I mean, you guys were mentioning earlier, like, yeah, there's Little Italy and Chinatown, and like, there's always been some amount of people, holding on to their like their mother
Heritage
tongue,
background.
almost like their heritage, their background, and it over time that assimilation happens. Like Thea, and I don't know, you'd mentioned that you're first generation, but like what I have tended to see is that a lot of times the parents don't learn English, and that it's the children that when they go
Yeah.
through public school, an entire life of public school, they end up
Yeah.
learning
Yeah,
English.
I mean, kids, it's yeah, it's hard to be born in the U.S. and then never learn English. But I live in a city, I'm in Los Angeles, where you encounter a number of people who really don't speak English, whether it be folks who speak Spanish. You can meet I have a very good friend from the academy actually, whose mom speaks Korean and it's never spoken English. And I went to her father's funeral and I could speak to like two or three people at her dad's funeral because none of them spoke English. And that was fine. I mean, I was in a space where it wasn't, I was there to help her mourn her dad. But it took me aback because I'm like, we're in Riverside, California, and no, everybody speaks Korean. But for me, the thing that's, again, with the culture, my mom is from Trinidad and Tobago. So luckily from that perspective, there's not a language barrier, but my mom's accent, I find it fascinating with my mom. If you guys were to meet my mom, I always said she had an anchor woman or like an operator accent. She speaks like English in that like perfect, proper way. But when my family comes around, suddenly her Caribbean accent comes out loud and clear. And I'm like, what is this? What's happening here? But that's just how she is. And but my grandparents were very big, I guess, ironically, my grandparents would very much agree with how Brett is explaining it. They felt that if you were going to come to the US, you had to do as much as you could to fit in. And part of that was speaking a certain English without a Caribbean accent. It was being respectable, going to school. And I guess it's a lot of the things that, I guess we would say defined American culture in the 60s when they came to the US. That's my grandparents very much, welcomed that. And they didn't want you really emphasizing that you were from another country, and they wanted their kids to go to school and go get degrees and be very successful. And I don't know if this exists in your family, Dion, but the model minority thing was very, very real. Like we had to go to college. We had to be lawyers and doctors. There was no acceptable, like, you weren't going to be an artist coming out of a Caribbean family. Like, it's like if you're like, oh, I'm going to be an actor, oh God, where have they forsaken me? My child wants to go into the arts. Like, that was not acceptable. But the irony is, I think American culture is being able to be whatever you want to be, right? The American dream is you can do anything and succeed. But the way immigrants, a lot of times, at least my family saw it as American, like the American dream was being successful and being contributing in that way. And so there is that tension there. Ironically, though,
So I want
now,
to
yeah, go on.
I want to kind of bring this around because you almost opened this up, Thea, with the American dream statement, which is Brett. Like when we're talking about like shared values, you mentioned that a couple of times. Do even the four of us have do we four have shared values? Like, could we espouse some number of things that we say, yes, this is one, all four of us share these, and two, we think that these are, shared American values, not just personal values that we happen to share.
How did we feel about the core values? I mean, all four of us took an oath. We all joined the same service. Did we all buy into the core values of the Air Force, which for our
Yeah.
audience would be integrity first, service before self, excellence in all we do, right? Did we believe in that?
I do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I did.
I'm good with
So-
I
those
think
three.
this is actually when I was thinking through this, that was one of the examples I was going to bring up, being that we all have that background being in the Air Force. Is again, you have those core values. It's not an exhaustive list of all the potential values that are out there. There's 3 right now. I mean, in terms of an American culture, I think there's probably a handful more than 3, but we're not looking at having the values that fit every single person all the time. But there is a core base value that has to be there. Right. And of course, those obviously extend from life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But there is a moral baseline that has to be in place. And when we start going into this just amoral society where you can have whatever morals you want, you can believe whatever you want, you can do whatever you want, I think we're going to create a lot of friction. And that's where we continue to get that tribalism. But if you look at the Air Force as that example, right? If someone doesn't abide by those core values, what happens?
Yeah, I mean, they're not able to stay in the military or in the Air Force, right?
They're no longer part of that culture. Right now, as a country, we can't quite operate that way. But in the same regards, like there almost should be a little bit of societal pressure to where if you don't abide by those, I don't know, maybe you're not welcome here. Maybe you're not a good fit for the country.
Even when you bring up life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, the 4 of us disagree on those.
Yeah.
I mean, we've had entire podcasts about,
liberty,
life versus liberty,
Yeah.
I mean, so to be honest, I tend to think of kind of American culture more along the lines of that there is so many different kinds and backgrounds and things that you can believe and still be considered an American. Because if life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, if there's so much disagreement even between the 4 of us just with those, I don't know how you can distill being an American down to a list of however many you want to, 3, 4, 5, values.
So one of the things that I was thinking about as I was doing my research for this week, and I realized that at least half of the people on this podcast are going to bring up the current administration. But I feel like for most of our country's history, one of our core values was the rule of law. And it felt like one of those things that we expected everybody who came here, like justice and the rule of law, were things that we expected to be applied. Now, we had some pretty crappy laws on the books, and we are making ways to correct that over time. And that also, I think, is an aspect of our country that is kind of a core value. Being such a young country, it seems like it's still part of our heritage and part of our DNA that progress is sort of built into American values. Those are kind of 2 things that really, no matter what I was reading, that kind of I pulled out and were kind of a long running thread through everything that I read.
So, Dion, in general, I would agree with you. And I would also say that the current administration does not believe in the rule of law when you have administration members saying that judges have no place determining the legality of XYZ.
I say, in all fairness, the last administration wasn't great about it either.
We'll agree to disagree on that one for now. But Dion, to devil's advocate on you, even the rule of law. So Lincoln's Lyceum address, he talks about how you have to follow the law, even if the law sucks. You work through the process to get the law changed. But then MLK from a Birmingham jail, it says, no, if the law sucks and you've gone through the process and you're still not seeing relief, then it's time to make good trouble as long as you accept the consequences of breaking that law. So even within the rule of law, that I do tend to agree that in general, the 4 of us would say we like the rule of law. American history and, Lincoln and MLK, 2 great Americans, would disagree on.
No, I disagree with the point, your conclusion. If MLK is saying you can push back as long as you're willing to accept the consequences of breaking the law. That's still accepting the rule of law. You're basically saying,
Yeah,
I may
that's
choose
true.
to break this law. I acknowledge that it has consequences, but I will choose to then break it and then adhere to those consequences. I
That's
think the
true.
problem that we're having now is where you have people saying, I don't like the law, or I think I should be the law, and therefore I shouldn't have to suffer the consequences of ignoring the laws on the books, or I get to disregard them and not be held accountable. And that's where I think it's antithetical to American culture, right? And I do agree with you. I think that is the rule of law has been part of our culture for better or worse, right? And that is a change that we're seeing. And then when we talk about like, the American dream, I think that that is part of American culture, this idea. And it goes back to, because all the American dream is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The pursuit of happiness piece of it is the quote unquote American dream. But it's such a complicated thing because it looks different. That's where I think if you were to say for the four of us, how do you define your American dream? It looks different for all four of us, right? Even though we agree that there's a thing, this amorphous thing that is the American dream, it does play out differently for everybody because that is going to look at where did you start and where are you looking to finish, and that's going to be unique. Yet part of being American is being able to have that dream and believe that you can accomplish it. Um,
Well, Tia,
and
I think the outcome of the
yeah,
dream might be different. If you ask people
yeah,
like what your dream is, the outcome might be different. But I think one of the core tenets that there is the equality of opportunity, that you have the
yeah,
ability to pursue that dream, right? And that's
yeah,
what I'm talking about when we look at American values and it's there. And I think again, the pushback we're going to see in today's culture around this one, I think is big, but there's starting to be a shift. But first and foremost is just having religious freedom, the ability to believe in God, right? There's a lot of places in the world that don't have that freedom. And so to believe the way you want is a key one, but following that up, you're going to have personal responsibility, individual liberty, family and marriage, I think is also a really big one too. And then of course, the rule of law, equality of opportunity, work ethic, I think is something that's there too. Again, that's the whole idea. If you don't work, you don't eat, having that mindset that's there. Service and sacrifice, being able, the willingness to serve not just the country, but your community, but also honoring those who serve. I think that's a big part of, understanding our culture too, not just military, but looking at like police and firefighters, those first responders. One, I think that's really gotten forgotten, civic virtue. People don't learn civics anymore. They don't understand the baseline there. But then it really comes down to is those moral absolutes, things that are definite right and wrong. And I think that's where we're starting to see the frayed ends of our culture, is that we're getting into this moral relativism where there aren't any absolutes anymore. And I don't know, at least for me, that's
well,
unfortunate.
I mean, one of the things you started with freedom of religion, like the freedom to have religion and believe in religion. But I also think a core American value is freedom from religion, right? And the ability to say that because I'm a Catholic versus a Protestant or Jewish versus Muslim, I don't have to be one or the other, or I could be none of the above. And where I think we're struggling right now, or a huge source of contention in our country, is where you are seeing religion being used as a weapon against people who don't adhere to it or don't want to have their life and their choices dictated by somebody else's comfort based on their religious beliefs. And so this is where you start getting into gay marriage and the idea that the people are starting to push back on the idea that if I'm gay and I'm a teacher in a school in Florida, does that mean I can't have a photo of my significant other on the desk, because then somehow my students are going to know I'm gay, and that's offensive to people of certain religions. If somebody is trans and that's somehow offensive to someone else's religion, now that person can't live out loud and live as a full citizen in our society. So I think that while I agree with you that certain things are part of, like, I would say, American culture, I don't know if we have a clear idea of where the lines are right now. And I think that's where a lot of the conflict is coming in. And I just use like the big issues as far as religion goes, but I mean, here's an issue that I have with, so again, some of our current, leaders, where the role of women, and as far as religion is concerned, I feel like we're now having conversations about, women, JD Vance, this idea that women aren't, don't have share Christian values and don't want to be wives and mothers. And somehow that's, offensive to American culture. I mean, that's where I'm like, okay, now if we're making the box smaller, it feels like, as far as what's acceptable. And then the smaller you make the box, then people who fall outside of it, they can't help but push back and say, well, where do I fit in this world that's being, as someone else is defining it?
Well, I mean, something to consider there is that, and I'm not saying that it's, again, not a right or wrong, but just more of a thought exercise for people, is that if you do fall outside of the box, today everybody's like, oh, well, you can fit wherever you want. Well, if you're outside of the box, maybe the thought should be, why am I outside the box? Is there a reason that I am? And
well, I'll tell you,
people
as
rarely
someone
want to look at themselves and say, I'm the problem. No, the box is the problem.
Well,
where there might be thought around it to where
but
you
as
might need to
someone who's
change how you
told
think.
that I fall outside the box and has been told that, I go, screw the box. Who told that box? I don't screw that box, because there's nothing wrong with, yeah, I'm not married, I have kids. Screw the box. If the box says I fall outside that box and that somehow makes me, I don't fit into American culture because of that, then screw the box. And that's what you're getting. You're going to get that. And I think part of being American is being able to say, I don't have to fit in your box. And I think what we should be doing is looking at making the box as big as possible and not drawing these lines that push people outside of it. And I do think that's what I'm hearing a lot of, this idea that you have to fit in this narrow, the box is getting smaller instead of getting bigger. And that I don't understand.
Yeah, and Brett, I was going to say, a lot of the things that you were mentioning, I mean, I understand why you're saying it, but I just don't, Thea took the big one with religion. I'll take the small one, like the Protestant work ethic, right? Like, what could be more American than being lazy? Like I should be able to not have a hard work ethic and not be called un-American because I'm lazy. Like, and I tend that's you now you take that and you take it across all the other things that you were mentioning. Like, I tend to agree with Thea that I should have the option to be or not be any one of those things, and it doesn't make me less American to not fit in the box.
So, Will, I mean, this kind of comes back around full circle to what we're talking about. Like, what does it mean to be American? It has to mean something, and because it can't mean everything. If it means everything, then it's meaningless. And so,
no, but I think it is closer to like, what does it mean to be an American? It means that you're free to be whatever you want to be. Like, that is, I take your point that it can't be everything because then it means nothing, but it's a lot closer to being anything you want to be, doing anything you want to do. Like, it's a lot closer to that, in my opinion, than you have to fit XYZ.
See, I have to push back on that, Will, because you get to the point where, like, yeah, you have the choice to be lazy, but guess what? You also have to deal with the consequences thereof. And it should not be my responsibility as an American citizen to pay for your laziness.
But see, that you're adding another step. So I think that's fine, because it comes back to what I said. That's fine. You want to, be lazy, then there may be consequences to you being lazy. And I think it's a different conversation as far as, like, okay, if I choose to live a lazy life, what does that mean for me? Right. I can be lazy and still be rich because I inherited money. Right. And we're okay with rich, lazy people. Right. We're just not okay with poor, lazy people. Let's be real. But I think
I'm not okay with rich, lazy people either.
But they're not a burden on you. Right. Like, the reality is, like, what you,
I don't think laziness is a uniquely American thing either. Like, you wouldn't look around the world and go, lazy equals American.
No, but the conclusion is, okay, if you're lazy, then that you shouldn't be a burden on somebody else. And so what I was saying is the reality is a rich, lazy person, then who cares, because they're not necessarily a burden on society, right? Because their funds they could pay their way out of having to do anything, right? I don't think anybody thinks that, name your socialite is the hardest working people, that they still have lots of money and, live these privileged lifestyles, right? I don't know. I tend to agree with Will. And so I guess we're, in the ends, the idea that part of being American is to be free to be who you want to be. Now, I think that also should come with whatever the consequences of being that is, in the sense of like, if you want to, say that I am going to be the first person to ever invent time travel, and you want to dedicate your life to inventing time travel, and that means that you don't, you're never able to live a lucrative lifestyle or whatever, okay, then fine. But you should have the freedom to live your life as you define it, and I think that is inherently American. And that's where I should get frustrated, where there are all these discussions, in particular happening on the right, where it seems what to be American is starting to be defined in these like narrow, rudimentary ways, and a lot of it is using the language of the past, right? To be that American values means that you live in, you live in a nuclear family, and you are all, you belong to a particular religion, and you live this very like this life within this box, and anyone who chooses to live a lifestyle that's different from that is somehow un-American. And I think that's part of where you're getting the tribalism, where you're getting the division, where you're getting the polarization, because you have one group saying to others, well, if you're not this thing, then you're not American. And I do think the right tries to own patriotism and Americanism in a way that I don't necessarily think the left does.
Well, I think the conversation comes to, Thea, that people are probably forecasting a bit to look to the future and seeing whether the American empire, so to speak, is going to continue, right? We're coming up on 250 years of being a country. But if you look back at history, again, history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it often rhymes. So it's one of those, like, if we don't look to change the directions that we're going, we're going to end up in the same predicaments, right? You look at the Roman Empire, and they were one that their decline came because of moral decay, civil disengagement, is the whole reliance on bread and circuses, right? Where they wanted free goods to pacify the public. Sorry, got a fellow aviator going on around here. But it's that whole idea that the republic died when the virtue of citizenry gave way to the political theater and the strongman rule. We're seeing that change. And I mean, you can even say the same thing about Greece, right? Their golden age of democracy gave way to philosophical relativism and the internal strife. And that's where we're seeing that is we have all this relativism where there's no absolutes for thing, and we're creating all of this tribalism. We're going to get to a point where America is no longer America, and it's going to become something else, and it can potentially fall apart because we will destroy ourselves from the inside, right?
Or
That's
we
just
could
going
be
to how it's
better
going to
than we
be.
ever were, because we could finally achieve the dream of all men are created equal, right? And men, including, or all people, are created equal. Like we could change and be decay, or we could change and be better than we've ever been, and we may actually become the thing that we always said we were going to be. And some of that, and that may not look like, the traditional quote unquote, everybody is a monolith. Like we may be a little Skittles bag, and we may have different flavors, and maybe that's who we were always meant to be, and I guess that's my whole thing. This idea that because we're allowing people to be different and we're embracing our differences doesn't mean that that's going to equate to our downfall. And I do hear a lot of fear that to allow a trans person to live as their full self in our society somehow means we're going to become Rome. And I'm not saying you're making that point, but I am saying I've heard those types of arguments. Like, since we've been doing this podcast, I'm starting to try to listen to other podcasts and some of the podcasts on the right, just to hear what other people are saying. And I hear some of these arguments, and I'm like, it's just like, I don't think the downfall of our country is going to be because we let a trans person use the bathroom they want, or that I'm a single parent to hear the right talk about it, I am the ruin of America because I'm raising children without a husband. And that according to the right, I am a burden on society. It doesn't matter that, based on me being a single mom, it's not even, it's just this assumption that because I'm a single mom, I'm not able to raise my children in a moral way and provide them the level of love and support, much less financial support that they need. I mean, it's hard for me not to get offended when I hear those discussions because there's no acknowledgement that, that you can provide love and support in different ways, in different forms. Like there's plenty of people who grew up with a mom and a dad and suffered abuse and trauma in those households. And I would argue the opposite is also true. There's plenty of people who grew up with single moms and turned out just fine, but it's like we don't want to acknowledge that it can look different. And that's where, like, I think when coming back to our DEI conversation, it's about like, in the theory of DEI was about like being inclusive, right, in our diversity. And I think when we talk about culture, if we define it narrowly, we lose that inclusion.
And Bright, you had mentioned that individualism was one of the things that you essentially considered a negative, but I mean that is also uniquely American, that we are very individualistic and I alone can do it and I can pull myself up by the bootstraps, and like that has been American culture in history, is that we are an individualistic society.
And I agree that, the rights of the individual do exist, but when you live in a world that when you start to look at it, you are the only person that is not other people, right? And so you can't live isolated by yourself completely from the world. I mean, I guess technically you can go find some spot and you can live off the land and you can learn how to do that. But to exist in a society means that there is an interdependence upon other people. And so, the whole idea of a self-made man, well, I hate to tell you, it took at least two people to make you to start with, right? So you got to start from somewhere. There's always that inclusion of society. And so when we could get so far away from I want everything for me and what is good for me, and we fail to look at what is the common good, what is actually best for society, what is best for others. Because again, we have to get away from this concept of right and wrong in a lot of things. Yes, there are some moral absolutes that some things are right, some things are wrong, but a lot of it is looking at more of, is it effective, right? Does this actually work? And you mentioned before in the past where we had these societies come together of like Little Italy and, Little China or Chinatown, things like that. That may have happened, but was it what was really best for the American culture as a whole as we continue to move forward? And I don't know that answer, right? But these are the kind of things that people should look at and think about when we come to this. And Thea, coming back to one of your points, when you say like the great outcome that we could move to is that we finally get to the point of all men are created equal. Well, I'd like to point out that created equal implies that there is a creator. And that is one of the things that I'm seeing in society today is we get to this idea that people forget that there's kind of two things you have to realize. And one is that there is a God and we are not him, right? And so having that there is an absolute rule to things that is beyond us, that beyond our ability to understand as humans is important, right? And when we forget that, we just get into this humanism thing, and then everything is free reign. And honestly, we're no better off than the rest of creation in that standpoint.
The only thing I'd push back on that, I mean, this doesn't work for the atheists and the agnostics, but I mean, created doesn't have to mean the Christian God. Like it can be Allah, it can be, I don't know, Shiva. Like you can still believe that all men are created equal without necessarily being a Christian.
Well, fun point with that. You realize that Islam, Christianity, and Judaism all actually have the same God.
I gotcha.
I mean, you can, Buddhism, let's throw it out. I mean, there's other religions out there. I agree with the issue with that people have, like, part of being American though is to be free to choose what you believe, right? And to not have to then be burdened by the beliefs of others. And so I do not believe that American culture requires you to adhere to one of the big three religions or
Agreed.
specifically to embrace those belief systems. And so I think that's where it's like, I don't want us to like leave this conversation saying that there is like this baseline where if you don't adhere to these things, then you're outside of American culture. Cause like just think that's antithetical to what it means to be free, right? I think a huge part of what we see as part of our culture is freedom. You know what I mean? Like, you 4th of July, right, is coming up. We're less than a month or a month away from the 4th of July. And you're going to see freedom plastered, all over the place and, all this stuff. And, home of the free, what is home of the brave? What's the phrase that I'm about to jack up?
Land of the
Land
free
of
and
the
home of the
free,
brave.
home of the brave, right? That's as American as apple pie, right? And so there are these values that maybe they're intention, but like, I agree. I think Dion's, now I'm coming back to Dion's point. Part of what it means to be American is to be able to disagree and to be able to have these conflicts and still all exist within one and appreciate the fact that we are different. I do think that's part of American culture. But I feel like that there's a tension that comes with it, and that's okay.
Sure.
But I do see people being so threatened, and this is where I'll say both sides are guilty of this. They're so threatened by just the conflict itself, and to me, the
Yeah.
conflict is inherently American.
Well, and Thea, that's one
but
thing
it
I
is
will
what
say
it
that
is.
I agree with you very strongly on is that we need to be able to engage in conversation. So many people have these
Yeah,
conversations and their immediate response is offense, right? And honestly,
yeah,
when people are offended, they tend to isolate and pull away from the conversation. Where honestly,
yeah,
like when we have disagreements like this, you should almost be provoked, right? To where you're like, oh, this stirs me up. I want to engage in the conversation and talk about it and have discussions. Of course, civil discussions, right? We're not yelling at each other. We're not screaming. We're not throwing things, but actually have civil discourse. That's, at least for me, why I joined this podcast in the first place is I want to spur those kind of conversations on where we can have that type of a dialogue. And we don't have to walk away agreeing on it, but at least we've been able to talk to each other and see those viewpoints and at least walk away and say, you know what? I'd never seen it from that perspective before. That will change how I think about things.
yeah.
So this
Or at
podcast
least it
is
informs your
American
views.
culture.
I mean, yeah,
What was that, Dion?
I said, so this podcast is American culture.
Hopefully part of it. Yeah.
That's probably a good place for us to go ahead and we're running low on remaining time here. And, but that's probably a good place for us to stop and get into what's been making us happy. But yeah, it does sound like we all agree that disagreement is fundamental to American culture, the ability to have different opinions, and that's okay.
Absolutely.
mm-hmm.
So
Okay,
who's
so
gonna?
what's
You want me
making
to
us?
get?
I'll start because wait, are you gonna do a summary?
Well, so Thea, you're gonna close us out, right?
Oh, that's right.
So
Yes.
yeah. So I'll go ahead and get started with what's been making me happy, and this one is, we just booked our summer vacation for this year. We're in August. We're going to go to the Bahamas for a week, and we're going to hang out on the beach. And I just the vacation itself is great, but there's that anticipation that I now have, right? Because before we booked the vacation, it was just, yeah, we're going to take a summer vacation. We don't know where, we don't know what we're going to do. We don't know for how long, whatever. Right. So it's nebulous, but once you like book the airline and the hotel and everything, you're like, I have this to look forward to. It's there on the calendar, and we're going to go and have fun. So that's what made me happy this week.
Nice. I was telling Dion and Brett before you got on that my wife convinced me to re-download World of Warcraft, and we spent like all day playing World of Warcraft. Our daughter plays with us sometimes. Our daughter's not as big into World of Warcraft, but it was so. One of the ways my wife and I bonded 10 years ago was actually with over World of Warcraft. She started playing and got me interested, and life got busy and we got rid of it for about 10 years, and we just recently kind of started again, and it's been kind of fun just to enjoy doing some kind of stupid hobby type thing together again.
Cool. Well, for me, it's actually nice weather in Ohio right now. And if you've been to Ohio, you understand that if you don't like the weather, you just wait 10 minutes, right? I mean, we're a state that we get all 4 seasons in one day. So it's just been nice lately to be outside, enjoying the weather, spending time with family. We've been doing bike rides lately. Today, I kind of got some one-on-one time with my oldest daughter. Technically, my youngest daughter was with me too, but she's 16 months, so she doesn't take a lot of attention right now. But I just got to have some conversations with my 7-year-old, and we were out at the park and walking around and playing on the swings and slides. And it's a fun time of year to enjoy the family and the young kids. So that's what's been making me happy.
So, oh gosh, sorry, there's a emergency alert. What's making me happy? I said last week that I was going to Colorado for the Air Force Academy's graduation. So I went. And last week, I was just happy to go see Andrew graduate, who is my graduate. So shout out to him. But what made me happy was I didn't think that it would be such like an emotional moment for me. And kind of my own journey. If anyone who's familiar with any of the service academies, it's there. I don't care who you are. Like your time there is not necessarily fun while you're there. And I remember by the time I graduated, I was just exhausted and I was just so ready to start my life and get out of there. And even though I've been back a few times, throughout the years, I graduated 19 years ago. Now this was the first time I went back for graduation, and it was the first time I really got to like kind of process what an accomplishment it was to have graduated from the academy and to kind of experience the joy of it without the exhaustion of kind of just reaching the finish line. So I cried, like when the kid had started marching out, and then watching them throw up their caps, even though they didn't get the Thunderbirds, the weather was bad, so they just threw it up, and there was no Jets. I felt bad for them in that sense, but it brought me a lot of joy and a lot of pride in my own journey and what it means to be an Air Force Academy grad. Love us or hate us, we still are. We exist. We're a fraternity, I guess, and I'm proud to be part of that. And I always say it was the best decision I ever made in my life was going to the Air Force Academy. It definitely changed who I am. I wouldn't be sitting here able to have this kind of conversation and have the perspective that I do had I not gone to the academy. I know that wholeheartedly. And so, so it just makes me happy to kind of see myself on the other side and see how far I've come. So on that note,
someone involved with that graduation said,
yeah.
The academy is not a great place to be, but it's a great place to be
great
from.
place to be from. And that is so true. And that was what I saw. And going back, it's such a homecoming. It was such a homecoming, right? Strangers, I met friends of Andrew, and the minute I said I was a grad, they're like, really? It's like, are we best friends now? Even though you're like 20 years older than me and like have but it's very true. And I know we call it the long blue line, which is a joke to like West Point and Annapolis. They always like roll their eyes when we say that, but I'm part of the blue line and it's nice to be part of that. So okay, but I don't know what we're going to talk about next week, guys, but I think this was a good conversation. I hope our listeners got something out of it. I think there was a little bit of disagreement, but I feel like, again, that's inherently American. So hopefully this was an enjoyable podcast for you guys. If you made it this far, like and subscribe, tell your friends, share this podcast on your social media if you're so inclined, but anything to promote it so we can keep doing this. And if you have any ideas or suggestions about topics or feedback, we'd love to hear feedback as far as like if you agree or disagree with anything that we've said. Shoot us a message or a comment. But otherwise, thank you guys for joining, and that's all we have for this week.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great week.